All right, we are back with Don Graves for another episode. We are moving on from the British Army, and we're going to talk more about the units that existed in Canada, the militia units. So, if you want to learn more about Don, his biographies and some of the earlier recordings, and I'll also add it to the episode description. So, welcome back, Don.
Welcome.
So, if I can ask, say just before the war, what was the situation in Upper Canada and Lower Canada as it relates to the militia? Like, what was the structure? What was the expectation of citizens for military service?
Well, it was a universal militia service for every male. I can't remember the exact ages. I think in Upper Canada it was 16 to 60. Uh, Lower Canada probably the same. The organization in Upper Canada was by county. You'd have each county had a regiment or regiments, um, and there wasn't much organization beyond a company. So, for instance, the First Lincoln Regiment would have six companies commanded by captains, and they'd have a lieutenant colonel, but there was rarely any concentration of the regiment that would move and fight as a regiment. Um, so each county had at least one, and Lincoln County had as many as had five. Um, there were about 11,000 militia, uh, uh, 11,000 men liable for militia service in Upper Canada in 1812. But the authorities thought it wasn't very wise to arm more than 4,000 of them. Problem was that between 1800 and 1812, there'd been a mass immigration uh, of Americans into Upper Canada, and they were attracted by free land. Like in the States, you didn't get that much free land. It's not that you had to pay for it, but you had to pay a certain fee every year until it was cleared. And what people would do in those days, like a young couple does today, they buy a modest house, fix it up, sell it, move on to a better house. What people did in those days was to take um, an acreage and get a working farm going on it. Um, so it was harder to do that in the States than it was in Canada because you could cross the border, swear an oath of loyalty, and get 200 acres of land. So you all you had to do was cut a certain amount of bush, and you had to do that anyway. So you would build a cabin, cut bush, uh, use burn it, sell a potash, and then build a better cabin, a bigger cabin. The smaller cabin became a cow shed, and then you could sell it and move on. And this was really quite a few Americans were attracted to Upper Canada, and this is why when war broke out, people were leery about the authorities were leery about arming all these people. That being said, a lot of Americans fought for the crown during the war. A lot of recent Americans. I guess there was. I was going to make a reference to modern political times and immigration policy and policing. Well, we'll just leave that. Don't
Please.
want to. Yeah. Uh, anyway, General Brock, being uh, the governor, wisely left the province just before the war broke out. Brock took over again. He was a military commander, but he took over the civil authority too. And you see, here's what I was saying in the previous episode. When you've got these civil and military, it, the civil weighs on you. See, Brock never declared martial law in Canada. Now, if I'd been a general governing an area surrounded on three sides by enemy territory, I would have declared martial law, got rid of habeas corpus, and he tried to do it, but the legislature voted it down. I think he could have declared it, but he didn't. Anyway, he did take steps to improve the militia by taking younger and more active militiamen in each regiment and forming them into what he called flank companies. There was 2 flank companies to every regiment, and here we get into this regiment and battalion thing in the militia, in the Upper Canadian Militia and in the Lower Canadian Militia. The regiment was a unit, but it was not wasn't a unit in, as I said, in terms of fighting or moving or acting as a unit. So when the war broke out, it was the flank companies that were called out, and by and large, they did okay. Um, the militia in the province, the Lincoln militia, were almost heavily involved from day one. The York militia, which includes that area, which from Toronto to Hamilton, were involved. The western counties, Middlesex, Essex, Kent, Oxford, were involved, and the St. Lawrence from probably Brockville down to Cornwall were involved. They saw more action. The Kingston regiments, not so much. Now, in Lower Canada, it was a bit of a different system. The militia weren't organized by counties because they didn't have a county structure. They were organized by parishes. A company was raised in each parish, and under the French regime in Quebec, there was a official known as the Capitaine de Milice, who was a very important local figure, not just for the militia, but he also was in charge of things like road construction and repair and things like this. So there was already an official. So the militia was raised according to a parish. And I think the figure is about 23,000 militia. But rather than use the basic militia structure, Prevost decided he would raise 6 or 7 battalions of embodied militia. So what my cat banging on a window. What do you want? Go to sleep. He would raise 6 or 7 battalions, and they were called the Select Embodied Militia, and they were balloted or drafted, and for various terms from 6 months to 18 months. Now these battalions were equipped, armed, and uniformed, and were long service militia, and they were the backbone of the militia service in the lower country. Now, that describes the militia, but I have to talk about another force here, which we haven't talked about too much. These were regular units raised for the near regular units raised for the duration of the war under the authority of the provincial legislatures. And they're not militia and they're not regulars. There's some kind of in between. I once christened them provincial regulars. So we'll start with those. And there are a lot of them. But the 2 main ones were the Voltigeurs Canadiens, and the Incorporated Militia Battalion of Upper Canada. Then you had a number of specialized units. You had provincial artillery drivers, guys who moved the artillery place to place. You had artillery units. There were 3 cavalry units raised. There was a troop in the Niagara, mostly commanded by Captain William Merritt. It had various names. There was a troop raised in and around the Lower St. Lawrence, that was Fraser's troop. I think they were called the Canadian Light Dragoons, and there was or the Canadian Light Cavalry, and a troop was raised in Montreal under Captain Coleman, and maybe they were called the Canadian Light Dragoons. Coleman's troop, or a good part of it, fought in Western Upper Canada, and you'd be familiar with them because they fought along with the Proctor's army.
Yeah, they're at the Battle of the Thames, and part of the retreat. So
That's right.
yeah.
That's right. Now these aren't regular units, and they're not militia units. They're somewhere in between. The key thing is the race for the duration of the war. There were two major infantry units were the Incorporated Militia Battalion of Upper Canada, and it was raised partially on the suggestion of my man Tom Pearson, who regarded militia officers as unprincipled imbeciles, and suggested if they could get the men from the militia, recruit them from the militia, he would appoint officers. He would know who to appoint and would train them, which was a good idea. The problem is politics and connections, everything got involved, and so you got a commission in the Incorporated Militia by who you knew, and they were poor Pearson. He raised, it was at his suggestion he raised this unit, and they ended up at Fort Wellington under his command. And if you well, you can read the daily orders he issued. They were a pain in his ass. Never. And Pearson was a martinet first class, and he tried his best to break them in. Later on, they were concentrated at York, another brawl in the officers' mess there. Can't remember the names offhand, but a major lost his commission for over. He didn't get it. He didn't start the fight. He was trying to break up the fight, and he got punches thrown at him. I haven't got the book handy, or I'd look him up. But anyway, the Incorporated Militia got down to the Niagara just after the Battle of Chippewa, and they were put in a brigade under Tom Pearson's command, which made neither party very happy. He had what they called a demi brigade, a half brigade. He had the Glengarrys, and he had the Incorporated Militia. Anyway, they fought at Lundy's Lane and lost close to 50% of their strength because they were on the left flank of the British line, which was caved in by the 25th U.S. Infantry, and it pulled back. Their commander was a captain from the 8th Foot named Billy Robinson, who was an Irishman and a wonderful, humorous man, just the kind of officer who could take this bunch of yahoos, turn them into a military unit, and a wonderful sense of humor. That he was wounded at Lundy's Lane, badly wounded. In Lower Canada, the regiment, which was really strange because it was actually raised under the authorization of the Crown, not the provincial legislature, but it was a provincially administered. I'm not sure. This is a voltigeur Canadien, or Canadian voltigeurs. Voltigeur is a French word meaning leaper, basically, and it was the French army term for light infantry. So you could think of the Canadian Light Infantry. It was raised just as war broke out. It was put under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Charles Michel Drummary de Salaberry, who was a professional officer from the British Army. He was a Quebecois, served in the British Army, and had been his mentor was General de Rottenberg. Now, de Rottenberg, not many good things. Well, some bad things are said about him in North America, but in his previous military career, he was an impressive soldier, and he wrote the manual for light infantry and rifle tactics in the British Army. The 1792 regulations had only a very, very slim part about light infantry and rifle tactics. Now, Rottenberg had commanded a German rifle unit. He wasn't British to begin with, and so he wrote this little, I guess you call it a pamphlet. He was Salisbury's mentor. Salisbury was very famous in the British Army for his physical strength. He was a martinet, the Voltigeur Canadian. You didn't get away with anything there if he could help it. But it was his physical strength, I think, is impressed most people. He fought a duel when he was stationed in the West Indies, and it ended when he cut his opponent from the neck about halfway through the abdomen with his sword. So you can see the kind of guy he was. He turned the Voltigeur Canadian into an excellent unit. They about half the unit stayed in Lower Canada and Eastern Townships during the war. The other half went to Upper Canada. 2 companies fought at Chrysler's Farm. 2 companies may have fought at Sackett's Harbor. A company or 2 ended up in the Niagara campaign of 1813. But their main battle and their main victory was Shadow Gate, where Salisbury commanded 4 companies of voltigeurs, some companies of select embodied militia, and I think a company of, I think it was 100 foot in a defensive position, and stopped an American offensive against Montreal under Major General Wade Hampton. Stopped him cold and did what the best thing to do if you're not really sure about your troops. He dug them in. And the Americans, mind you, Wade Hampton really wasn't all that determined to carry out his offensive completely, but he stopped them. Later on, they participated in the 1814 Plattsburgh campaign. So these are the provincial regulars. There were some other companies down in Lower Canada called the Frontier Light Infantry, and they were later amalgamated with the Voltigeur Canadian. In Kent County, there was now I'm not sure whether you would call this unit fencibles or provincial regulars, doesn't matter. The Kent Rangers, it was a company size unit.
There was the Caldwell Rangers, right? There was, yeah, they were, I think, what was it, Prevost, or was it someone that was, anyways, they campaigned for the longest time to get approval for them.
Yeah,
They had green coats, but a cut down shako, like it wasn't as tall as the standard one. And I
yeah.
believe the indigenous nickname for them were the Black Stumps or something like that. But I don't think there was ever a whole lot of them. Like it's,
Oh. The Black Stumps, by the way, were what the Indigenous warriors called the Glengarries,
was it?
because they
Okay.
dark green uniform. I don't know. Uh, there's not much information about the Caldwell Rangers. But so you've got when we go back to this, you've got this. You've got the regular British Army, the regiments of the line. You've got fencibles, which are regular units, but only required to serve in British North America. You've got this kind of in between group, which I call provincial regulars, and you've got the militia, which are different in each province. The militia in New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, Cape Breton, which was a separate colony, and Newfoundland are like the militia of Upper Canada. They're organized by county. And there's also a number of, I think there was some provincial regular units. Oh, any questions have you got?
No, I guess so. The militia went pre-war from, I think, being pretty casual, right? What wasn't a lot of these guys, they would muster once a year, that they would try to take them through drill, but the majority didn't even have muskets. Like they were carrying rakes and brooms, and the highlight was tapping it into the kegs of beer on the back of a wagon. Like I think that was their
Or
military obligation, right? So
if you were smart, you held it near a tavern and did a few evolutions, um, counted the muster roll or read the muster roll, see who was present, and then you had a jollification. Yeah.
yeah, so my impression is 1812, the militia, or at least the flank companies, were leaned on pretty heavily. Like they shortage of regulars in Upper Canada. They needed these men to augment their strengths. But then as the war went on and you had more fencible regiments, you had these provincial regulars, as you call them. My feeling is the militia started being used less and less, right? Like, weren't they a lot of road building, guarding baggage, and various things like that?
When the Americans invaded the Niagara in 1813, they set out on a very robust program of paroling the militiamen. You gave your parole, signed your name, and until you were exchanged for an American militiaman in British captivity, uh, you didn't have to serve in the militia. You could go back to your farm. So these guys are all mostly farmers, so they're just rushing to serve, sign up for a parole. And Americans were paroling uh, boys of 15 and grandpas of 65, 70. Get the numbers up. So that you have this great uh, list of paroles, like 1,500. And when the American Army pulled back to Fort George, the British Army moved in to blockade the fort. They called these guys out and they said, "No, got a parole, can't serve, can't serve." Oh, okay. That means you can't serve in a military capacity, but you can build barracks and transport stuff. Okay. Oh, yeah. So that's what they did. But um, after the burning of Newark and a lot of the depredations that took place uh, in the Niagara in 1813 by the Americans, the next year those paroles were up in May and June, and when Jacob Brown, General Jacob Brown, put his army across the Niagara on the 3rd of July, the militia weren't putting up, were really volunteering. So it was strange. They were really eager in 1812, not so eager in 1813, and eager in 1814. I think it all has to do with their their families and their property. But you're right, they really weren't as important by 1814 because this has become a war of regular or near regular versus regular, and it got bloodier and bloodier as it went on. The highest casualties suffered by a centenary or ordinary militia unit was the Second Lincoln Regiment at Chippewa, and they lost 22 men of all types, killed, wounded, and missing. And that was, you know, they probably only had 150, 200 men. That's a substantial casualty, and they were written up in general orders for it.
So I think it was Bishop Strawn, the militia myth. Can you speak a little bit on that? That was more post-war, right? The
Oh yeah, got to talk about the militia myth. Well, Strawn gave a sermon in York in I think December 1812, and he said words to the effect that it will be known in the future that the province was saved by our brave militiamen and a few British regulars. And this sort of grew like Topsy, this myth, till mid-century. You had Egerton Ryerson, who whose name was on a university till recently. Uh, um, and he wrote in one of his histories of Upper Canada. Um, it was a small but brave band of Spartan militiamen assisted by a few British regulars who saved his province. And it went on, and Cruikshank, who should have known better because he had all the documents, he had it all in front of him. He could have stepped in right away and said, no, it was the regulars who did the fighting and the dying. Uh, but he didn't. And it wasn't until 1956 that Charles Stacey, a professor at U of T and um, the Army's official historian, uh, gave a paper and then contributed an article, and he just laid it out. You know, you know, the armies did the fighting; they saved the province, but it took 150 years, and that militia myth was prevalent.
I'm not sure it's all entirely dispelled, or maybe it's political expediency, like the War of 1812 monument on Parliament Hill in Ottawa, right? So who do they highlight? That they got Indigenous. I think there's a woman settler, Provincial Marine, and then the regiment they chose was Royal Newfoundland Regiment, right? So they really wanted to make it as Canadian as possible.
Isn't there a British regular in there? I
No,
can't remember.
it was supposed to be a 41st guy, but then the government or sculptor changed it to Royal Newfoundland Regiment.
Well, that's pretty close to regular. I mean, I was at the what do you call it, the commemoration, and I think it's a nice statue. I really like it.
Oh yeah, I've visited it a number of times. Yeah, uh, a couple interesting ones in Upper Canada, predominantly. The Colored Corps. Can you speak on them for a moment? That was an aspect of militia, right? So,
Um, I did overlook them, but that is one of these sort of in between units I talked about. It started out as it was raised in 1812, a company under a man named Runcie, Captain Runcie's company. Runcie had been thrown out of the Lincoln militia for disgracing himself. I think it was drink, maybe drugs, who knows? Uh, and you have to remember that these were not average militiamen. These were skilled tradesmen. They were wheelwrights, carpenters, quarters, um, etc. They were paid more than the average militiaman, and they were skilled and useful. Uh, so they were in battle at Fort George, the attack on. They manned a battery. Um, they might have defended. They probably defended Fort George in 1814 when Brown's army moved up. But you also have to remember they were very small in numbers, 35, I think, at the maximum. But they did a bit. And it's interesting. In 1837, 38, when you have the Patriot troubles and you have Americans coming across the border, the most loyal and eager of militiamen were the black militiamen in Niagara. By this time, slavery had been abolished, and there were more blacks uh, immigrating. And I use that word, let's say, coming over the border, and they didn't want to go back over the border. And they were very, very uh, good, turned out. And they
same
were,
down in Essex County, in the Amherstburg area. Like during that, they were either a company or a strong part of the Essex militia. Yeah. All right. And then the other one, and this is kind of strange. Provincial Marine, although they managed transportation on the water and then ultimately became Royal Navy, but originally they were part of the Board of Ordnance, weren't they? Technically, they were
Oh,
part of
they were
the British Army establishment.
part of the quartermaster's department.
Okay.
Quartermaster responsible for moving goods. They were the Navy at the outbreak of war. The Provincial Marine were as a Navy on the Great Lakes, Lake Ontario and Erie. There wasn't much. I think there was only one warship out of Sackett's Harbor, American warship, and their job was to move troops and supplies, and they made a little. Captains made a bit in the side, moving civilian passengers up and down the Great Lakes, but the captains were a very, very superannuated lot. I think the average age was 63, and they didn't have the spark of the Royal Navy. So it was decided that they would be turned over to the Royal Navy, and that happened in the spring of 1813 when Yeo came and took over command of the warships on the lakes, and the Provincial Marine disappeared. Now,
And the nature of the topography in Upper Canada or the lack of development, the shipping was vital, right? Because the roads were limited. Those that existed were horrible and rarely passable, so that most of the population was clustered along the water, and that's how you move troops and supplies was pretty well strictly by water. So
if you look at the fortifications, they're all on water, by the water. The route was boat convoys from Montreal to Prescott, transshipment to lake vessels, which would get you up to the Niagara. As far as Queenston, you could go up the river. Then you were put them on wagons and went around the portage to Chippewa when you put them back on boats, and they went down to Fort Erie and Lake Erie. There was the Portage Road, which is what it was called, between Queenston and Chippewa, was a heavily traveled route before the war. There were 10 to 12, there was 10 to 12 stages a day, and it was constant traffic of freight wagons. It was 12 miles. So it was a busy thing. It was a busy thing, a busy spot, and a well-trafficked spot. Interesting thing is, on the American side of the Niagara, there was a portage, but it never really got off as did the Queenston Chippewa. A lot of Americans brought their goods over the border and then shipped them that way.
oh, I'd always had the impression that the Americans had theirs too, and the Queenston
Yeah,
Chippewa one was created when Fort Niagara was turned back over to the Americans.
no,
Okay, no, it's
it
interesting learning for
was
me. So,
Porter Barton uh, portage. Big problem they had was getting up Lewiston Heights. I think the thing was it was cheaper to go up Canadian side. It was there, but it was never as uh, profitable as the Canadian one was. You have to remember, and it's still true today, the Canadian side of the border was more heavily populated than the American side. You know, uh, I've often remarked to myself, going from Cornwall to Kingston, driving the old Highway 2, which is the river road, it's settled. But if you go across the border and drive down through Malone, it's about one third of the settlement on the Canadian side. So, yeah.
interesting. All right. Well, I think that gives us a good picture of the militia for Upper and Lower Canada. Why don't we finish that there, and then we will plan our next episode. So, thank you, Don.
Okay. Good to talk to you.